The ancient and medieval world was filled with the unknown, and for many who lived in these eras, the unknown was a source of fear. The edges of maritime maps warned of hulking monsters waiting to devour any who would sail beyond their ordained territory, while the most exotic places on the planet were said to be the home of frightening, malformed beasts, humanoid creatures with their faces in their torsos, or who shaded themselves with a single enormous foot. But at the time, perhaps the most well-known of all these bizarre beings were the cynocephali, a race of dog-headed people who lived well outside the realms of civilized society. In those past ages, these canine hominids weren't mythical. They were a virtual certainty, so much so that questions of their intrinsic humanity was debated among scholars and church fathers alike. But just who were the cynocephali? Were they a myth dreamed up by oral tradition? Why do legends of similar dog-human hybrids appear throughout different ages and cultures? Or is it possible that such a people actually existed? Settle in, dear traveler, because the answers to those questions will take us on a journey across continents and through time. One of the earliest accounts of the cynocephali dates back to around 400 BC. In Indica, Greek physician Ctesias describes the wondrous land now known as India, where trees grew to staggering heights, elephants roamed the jungles, and a race of dog-headed people inhabited the lofty and inaccessible mountains. They speak no language but bark like dogs, and in this manner make themselves understood by each other. They understand the Indian language but are unable to converse, only barking or making signs with their hands and fingers by way of reply. They live on raw meat. Ctesias goes on to say that these strange people are agile and efficient hunters, though they also breed livestock and have established trade routes with the king of India. But although they were clearly intelligent creatures, Ctesias notes that they preferred to live in caves and sleep on the ground, as opposed to the idealized version of society the Greeks were used to. Perhaps most remarkably, Ctesias claims that they are just and live longer than any other men, 170, sometimes 200 years. At a time when the average life expectancy was around 40 years old, this was a very long lifespan. Centuries later, the famous explorer Marco Polo described a similar people, this time localized to the Andaman Islands. But unlike Ctesias' description, these cynocephali were far more vicious and barbaric. The people are without a king and idolaters, and no better than wild beasts. And I assure you, all the men of this island of Angamanen have heads like dogs, and teeth and eyes likewise. In fact, in the face they are all just like big mastiff dogs. They have a quantity of spices, but they are a most cruel generation, and eat everybody that they can catch, if not their own race. They live on flesh and rice and milk, and have fruits different from any of ours. Of course, the infamous John Mandeville also published an account of the cynocephali in his travels, which circulated in the mid to late 1300s. This account is more similar to Ctesias in that the cynocephali are described as intelligent and reasonable, even devout, with the only odd characteristic being that they tend to eat their prisoners of war. After that isle go men by the sea ocean, by many isles, unto an isle that is clept Nakumera, that is a great isle, and good and fair. And all the men and women of that isle have hounds' heads, and they be clept cynocephales. And they be full reasonable and of good understanding, save that they worship an ox for their god. And also every one of them beareth an ox of gold or silver in his forehead, in token that they love well their god. They be great folk and well fighting, and if they take any man in battle, anon they eat him. The cynocephali remained in the public consciousness for centuries, though their location seemed less than concrete. While Ctesias placed a very large dog-headed population high in the mountains of India, Marco Polo and Mandeville placed them in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, an archipelago far off India's eastern coastline. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, a famous and sprawling map of the known world circa 1300, assigns the cynocephali much closer to Europe. The cynocephali would make another appearance on the Piri Reis map of 1513, which was reportedly based on maps made by Columbus. This time, the cynocephali are depicted on the northern coast of South America, though by this time the dog-headed people of legend had come to be associated with the anthropophagi, or cannibals, that were actually found in the Caribbean. Ultimately, though, these juxtapositions of man and beast were not limited by location, culture, or even humanity. Now we'll take a step back to examine the dog-headed people as a whole, from their role in divinity to the absolute essence of what makes us human. Thousands of years before Ctesias, beings with the bodies of men and the heads of canines were not unheard of. For the ancient Egyptians, Anubis was the protector of graves, the lord of the underworld, and the god who ushered souls into the afterlife. Most often, he was depicted as a man with the head of a dark-haired jackal or wolf. This black coloration represented the soil of the Nile River, Egypt's source of life, as well as the color of embalmed bodies, which simultaneously symbolized death of the body and the beginning of the afterlife. The Egyptian culture placed enormous significance on symbolism, and the fact that Anubis was represented with the head of a jackal is no coincidence. Jackals patrolled the Egyptian cemeteries, stealing in under cover of night to raid their shallow graves and feast on the bodies buried there. These wild dogs also lived on the outskirts of Egyptian cities and were a constant source of trouble. As god of the dead, Anubis' canine appearance allowed him to ward off members of his own kind as he transported souls to the afterlife. In short, the dog-headed god was a way to fight fire with fire. For the Egyptian people, Anubis' seemingly opposing aspects, animalism and deity, chaos and order, combined to form a kind of balance. And for the god who weighed the scale of your life, this balance was a comfort. A few thousand years later, the same aspects that expressed balance in the Egyptian god of the underworld came to be seen as a treacherous dichotomy between who mankind was and who he desired to be. 4th century theologian and philosopher Augustine of Hippo devoted much thought to the cynocephaly, and particularly whether they were merely animals without a soul or beings with a rational mind and as deserving of salvation as any other man. What shall I say of the cynocephaly, whose dog-like head and barking proclaim them beasts rather than men? For God, the creator of all, knows where and when each thing ought to be, or to have been created, because he sees the similarities and diversities which can contribute to the beauty of the whole. But he who cannot see the whole is offended by the deformity of the part, because he is blind to that which balances it, and to which it belongs. For Augustine, the essential humanity of the cynocephaly was important. Those who argue that humanity is based on appearance or the ability to speak miss the point entirely. Instead, it was rationality that separated man from beast, and as a rational people, the cynocephaly were as much a part of the human family as those born with deformities. As therefore no one will deny that these are all descended from that one man, so all the races which are reported to have diverged in bodily appearance from the usual course which nature generally or almost universally preserves, if they are embraced in that definition of man as rational and moral animals, unquestionably trace their pedigree to that one first father of all. 100 years later, the other side of that argument was taken up by Saint Isidore of Seville. He wrote that the cynocephaly's method of communication, barking, reveals them to be more beasts than men. The 8th century Liber Monstrorum, a catalogue of wondrous creatures, takes this a step further, saying that the cynocephaly actually pervert language by barking. Both Isidore and the author of Liber Monstrorum take a clear stance. Language is what separates human from inhuman. For great minds like Isidore and Augustine, the cynocephaly were worth considering, partly because of the very real possibility that they actually existed. By most accounts, they had a functioning society, even an important role in their respective kingdoms. And as to the question of their ability to receive salvation, well, the appearance of a certain dog-headed saint may provide the answer. According to medieval legend, only a couple of hundred years after the death of Christ, a man named Reprobus was born in a land called Canaan. Besides being barbarous and generally unpleasant, he was also a giant, between 7 and 12 feet tall depending on the source. Because of his imposing size, Reprobus sought only to serve the mightiest person on earth. For a time, he thought that person to be the Canaanite king, but when he saw his king make the sign of the cross whenever someone mentioned the devil, he realized that Satan must be the most powerful being on earth. He sought out the devil and served him for a time, but as Reprobus and his new master passed near a cross on the side of the road, he saw that the devil was terrified of it. The devil told him that the sign of Christ filled him with fear. Reprobus knew he had to seek out this Christ, who could make even the devil cower in fear. He came across a hermit who taught him all about this most powerful God. In an effort to enter Christ's good graces, the hermit recommended that Reprobus utilize his immense size to carry people across a dangerous local river, where many died in crossing. One day, as he was doing this, a small child asked Reprobus to ferry him across. He hoisted the boy onto his shoulders and began to cross. As he did, the child grew heavier and heavier until even he was in danger of drowning. "O child," he cried, "how heavy thou art! It seems I bear the weight of the world on my shoulder." And the child replied, "Right thou art. Thou bearest not only the world, but the Creator of heaven and earth. I am Jesus Christ, thy King and Lord, and henceforth thou shalt be called Christophorus, that is, Christ-bearer." Reprobus, now known as Christopher, would go on to convert entire cities for the Lord's cause before being martyred sometime between the 3rd and 4th centuries. It's an intriguing tale to be sure, but why mention him here? Well, the earliest portraits of the patron saint of travelers depict him not only as a giant, but as a human with the head of a dog. Yes, in early church tradition, Saint Christopher was a cynocephaly. Virtually all of what we know about Saint Christopher stems from accounts written in the Middle Ages, the same period of time when documents by Polo and Mandeville presented their descriptions of dog-headed men at the edges of the world. The Irish Passion of St. Christopher, a 15th century biography of sorts, describes the saint as retaining his feral appearance well after his conversion. There was a persecution of Christians in time of the Emperor Decius, and the holy man Christopher was taken and tortured like the others. Christopher was exceedingly wise, and had observed that the Lord assisted those of the heathen who believed just as much as he assisted Christians. Now this Christopher was one of the dogheads, a race that had the heads of dogs and ate human flesh. He meditated much on God, but at that time he could only speak the language of the dogheads. When he saw how much the Christians suffered, he was indignant and left the city. He began to adore God and prayed. "Almighty God," he said, "give me the gift of speech. Open my mouth and make plain thy might, that those who persecute thy people may be converted." Here again, the ability to speak seems to be the crux of both humanity and rationality. And similar to cynocephaly in the distant lands of India, St. Christopher originally hailed from the distant and heathen land of Canaan. Though the Church no longer incorporates the cynocephalic iconography that was popular in the Middle Ages, there has been much speculation as to why St. Christopher was depicted with the head of a dog in the first place. Some say that it's a simple translation error. The word Canaan, even in the original Greek, sounds a lot like canine after all. Others say that this imagery is a kind of spiritual successor to Anubis, the god of the underworld infiltrating Christianity. Of course, the simplest explanation is that Reprobus was actually part of a race of dog-headed men whose countenance was miraculously transformed to match his kind heart. However it began, or whatever truth can actually be found there, the legend of St. Christopher serves a purpose that transcends simple translation errors or artistic liberties. It provides a glimpse into the medieval mind. With similar imagery appearing in texts and descriptions dating back millennia, why were these legends of dog-headed people so pervasive? The answer could be a case of mistaken identity in more ways than one. The reasons for the cynocephaly's appearance in so much of medieval literature has been the source of much academic debate. The fact is that early explorers tended to infuse their tales of exotic lands with whimsical descriptions. Rather than a cotton plant, for example, John Mandeville described a plant that grew tiny living sheep. For modern scholars, the only question is how to find the grain of truth in these larger-than-life accounts. One possible explanation for the dog-headed men has been around since at least the 13th century, when Albert the Great, in a description of baboons, noted that they are those who are called the dogmen in the Mappa Mundi. It's certainly conceivable that the appearance of certain primates, like the baboon, could be interpreted as a dog-like face with a humanoid body. But while the people of ancient and pre-modern times were certainly known to be superstitious, they were also known to be fearful and mistrustful of those they considered to be outsiders. Many modern historians believe that the cynocephaly were a manifestation of this fear. The animal nature of these monsters were extreme personifications of those who lived outside of civilized society. Interestingly, the evolution of the medieval sentiment toward outsiders can be observed in the illustrations of cynocephaly that appeared throughout that time period. Early 15th century illustrations of travels by Mandeville, for example, depicted the cynocephaly as civilized, often with armor or clothing, engaging in conversation, establishing agriculture, and even dwelling in colorful cities. But as the century progressed, the depictions of cynocephaly began to change. Instead of maintaining a civilized society, they were now animalistic cannibals, shown attacking and eating noble human victims. It's likely no coincidence that this shift in tone coincided with Columbus's expeditions in the late 15th century. The known world was expanding, and as the edges of the map pressed outward, the domain of the monsters was diminishing. Now, it wasn't India or Canaan that contained the most barbarous of all races, it was the Caribbean. Columbus expected to find monsters there, but upon his first voyage, he was met with only normal human beings. When Columbus also didn't find the vast wealth of riches he had promised his financiers back in Spain, he set his mind on a different source of wealth: people. The crown, however, was not willing to endorse the large-scale enslavement of the natives, and so outright forbade it. But on Columbus's second voyage to the Caribbean in 1494, he encountered what he considered to be much more in line with the monsters he expected. He found actual man-eaters, tribes of anthropophagy or cannibals. Because of their abhorrent habit of eating human flesh, Columbus was able to justify their exportation and extermination. Eventually, the crown would even institute the so-called cannibal law, which, in contrast to the freedom granted to other native people, allowed for the enslavement and subjugation solely of cannibals. Sadly, it could be argued that this precedent contributed to the complete extinction of even the peaceful Taino people, largely due to enslavement, mistreatment, widespread murders, and disease given to them by their European overlords. For many people of the time, the cannibal tribes were the real-life equivalent of the cynocephaly, a people so bestial, vicious, and uncivilized that they could not truly be classified as human. Of course, many other people felt the opposite way, that no matter how inhuman one's outward appearance may be, the ability to think and reason is enough to deem them worthy of acceptance. After all, even dog-headed people contribute, as Augustine put it, to the beauty of the whole. The question of whether or not the cynocephaly actually existed ultimately doesn't matter much. Either way, their role in history is just as significant. Combined into one body, they represent both the best and worst of humanity, nobility and carnality, peace and violence, even sinner and saint. Eventually, the dog-headed men began to disappear from the public consciousness altogether. Like the Sciapods and Blemye and other monsters of the time, they simply lost their place in the world. But we can still learn from them even today. After all, as Sam Ottawell Soulsby writes in the Journal of Urban History, to read a description of the cynocephaly is to read an argument about what it means to be human. For more medieval monsters, be sure to check out this video, and a huge shout out to my patrons, it is much appreciated. And as always, thanks for watching, and remember, you matter.